has suddenly begun to change his tune. He said he's willing to discuss arms control. He said that today, which the Russians have refused to do for the last few years. I think he really wants to meet with President Trump because that would show that the West can't isolate him anymore, and it would sort of shore up his domestic and international legitimacy. But I don't think he's really interested in ending this war anytime soon because he thinks he's winning. So he'd like to meet with President Trump, and I think he would be willing to start some kind of negotiations. But his people have so far rejected all the terms that General Kellogg, who's President Trump's envoy, has mentioned, and what President Trump himself has said. Yeah.
So realistically, Angela, what do you think President Trump can get done vis-a-vis the Ukraine, and under which time period?
So, I mean, the time period is very vague. He was unable to stop the war in 24 hours. Now he's talking about 6 months. He really has to have enough leverage to force Putin to the table and to agree at least to a ceasefire and then negotiations. And we saw yesterday at Davos that he threatened sanctions again, and the day before, and tariffs and things like that if Russia didn't come to the table. I think we have to see how much leverage he really has.
I look, Angela Stent, at Mr. Putin and the unknowns of Putin, and you've been wonderful about providing clarity there. And in the recent days, we've done China interviews where the Chinese in Beijing separate foreign discussions from domestic discussions. Is it the same for Putin in Moscow? Does he separate the collapse of the Russian economy from foreign policy discussions, or is it more like America?
So, I mean, he tends to separate everything. But I think in this case, another thing that President Trump has said is that if the Russians appear willing to negotiate, then he might provide sanctions relief. So I think Putin would be looking for sanctions relief, even though he denies publicly that his economy is in trouble. We know that it is. So I would expect to see that if the negotiations happen and if discussions proceed, in a fairly productive way.
Angela, what do we know about Putin's support within Russia itself, the popular support? What do we know about that?
So as far as we know from the one remaining independent pollster, he still has the public support for this war. Okay. But more than 50% of the Russians now say there should be negotiations, but they also say we should not give up any of the territory that we've taken in Ukraine. So far, his popularity is quite strong. If the economy really gets much worse and people feel the pinch, then that could change.
Does he want to, is it just as simple as Angela Stent that Mr. Putin wants to Crimea eastern Ukraine?
I mean, he wants Crimea, he wants eastern Ukraine, but he wants much more than that. He wants to sit down with President Trump and really do another Yalta. In other words, get the United States to agree that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence, not only in the post-Soviet states like Ukraine, but even in the former Warsaw Pact states. He's been explicit about that. That's what he wants. He ultimately wants a grand bargain.